that night, nothing had happened, and we'd been on pretty much a ready alert status for weeks on end because they had constant strikes going over. In fact, just to digress, we could, in some of the strikes when we were flying there, you could watch the aircraft, if they were in close enough to the coast, you could watch them make their bombing runs and see the puffs of smoke coming up and that. But so this night we were sitting around and everybody's relaxing, and I'd watched some forgettable movie in the wardroom, and about 11 o'clock I had gone to bed, and everybody's in there, and I was in bed just about half an hour, 40 minutes, something like that, and all of a sudden, SAR alert, bong, bong, bong. And so jumped out of the rack, got into my flight suit, and ran aft to the flight deck. And my pilot, Clyde Lassen, his job was then to go to CIC, the Combat Information Center, to get a briefing on what this was all about. And my job was to get the aircraft, the engine started, and get everything up to releasing the rotor brake. And so that's where we were, and he came back, jumped in the aircraft, and now this is midnight, and like I say, we aren't flying at night too often, and there was no moon. It was a black night, which made, and the significance of that for helicopter pilots and any pilot is that there's no horizon. And without a horizon, you are totally dependent on the gauges. And now here we are, we're taking off of a ship that's probably where the flight deck was about 8 feet above the water, maybe 10. And the other thing about it is this was a single engine H-2. They've right after this, they went to adding a second engine. But the single engine H-2 was very underpowered in that high humidity of the Tonkin Gulf. And on a normal day, we would sometimes take off, leave one crewman on the deck, take off and get into the air, limp into the air, which usually meant diving down towards the water to get about 5 feet of it so that you could get what is called ground effect, but over the water, and suppose they'd call it water effect, but the rotor system is pushing down on the waves that gives it a little more efficiency, and the aerodynamics of the fuselage, once you get enough speed, the fuselage itself will provide a little bit of lift, of residual lift. But we would have to take off, go dump fuel of at least 200 or 300 pounds, which is the weight of one of our crewmen, and then come back and land and pick up the second crewman. So that was what we were taking off with on that dark night, except we had both crewmen on board and a little cooler. But again, we dove towards the water on instruments from 8 feet, and then got airborne and went up. And so then Clyde gave us a briefing that said that there had been a aircraft shot down about 15, 20 miles inland from the coast. They thought the pilots were still successfully evading, that they hadn't been discovered yet because it was late at night and everybody was sleeping. And so he said, well, we'll just go up, and we have to sit and wait to see if we're told to go in or not. And we agreed we would not be told to go in. Nobody had ever done it before. There wasn't enough time to organize any sort of a close air support at this point. The Jolly Green from the Air Force, their way of doing it, they went in, just bombed the heck out of everything around, and they did a lot of close ground support. And we in the Navy had not done too many inland rescues. A few had been done from my squadron. So we said, we're not going in. We'll sit up here for half an hour and they'll call us back. Our biggest problem is how we're going to get back on board without crashing this thing. Well, they pulled the rug out from under us. They said, yep, your signal is Charlie, you can go. Now, in order to get approval, and there was a person called Harbor Master, that was their call sign, I forget what the CTF designation was, but they were sitting down there, and their staff was assessing everything, and there were several things that had to take place. One, they had to have positive contact with the survivor. They had to have, the survivor had to be successfully evading capture, and in that, and they had to authenticate their validity of who they were. And that was done, everybody, when they went over, had a sheet of paper to fill out, a form that they gave answers to. What's your favorite color? What's your favorite ice cream? What's your mother's maiden name? You know, those kind of questions that only they would know the answers to. And so we said, that's not going to happen. But then again, they did. Now, where we were at the time was right at off the coast of, almost parallel to Vin, maybe a little bit north of it. And Vin was noted for having the most anti-aircraft missile defense systems around. They just, when you looked at a map of North Vietnam and the little red dots showed where the anti-aircraft was, Vin was almost all red. There was just everything there. So we had a rescue combat air patrol who was giving us vectors and steers overhead. We had a man air traffic controller on board the ship who had taken the Mayday call from the F-4 crew. The F-4 crews was John Holtzclaw and John Burns. Zeke Burns and Claw were their nicknames. And they had been on a mission where they were looking for some what they called movers, any trucks or anything going along. They had a flight of 3 aircraft, 2 F-4s and an A-6. And they had their procedures for going. Well, what happened is that the F-4, root beer was the call sign, got locked on by a surface-to-air missile. And they evaded the first one, they evaded the second one, and in order to evade these two, it was jinking and zigging, and they were moving back and forth. Well, by the time the third one came up, they had lost their airspeed, they'd lost their altitude, they'd run out of everything but ideas, and it hit the wing, and they managed to eject and come down over this rice paddy and get back together, and then made their way up a small mountainside, which is an outcropping of rock. And first time I heard the term karst, but that's the geological name for it. So they were down, and this rice paddy surrounded by a bunch of villages, and successfully evading. They hadn't been captured yet, but people were looking for them because now they had awakened the neighborhood. And so when we went in, we went up just north of Vin and turned up this little valley. Now, it's not like we were flying down the valley. We were at about, what are we going at? I think at about 3,000 feet, which was outside of the small arms fire in case there, but that put you right up in the range for anti-aircraft. And it was we could see the F-4 burning up at about our 10 o'clock position, probably 15 miles away. And it's a big bright glow in that. Now, the only way that we could find people on the ground is we had very rudimentary instruments for detecting people. Every pilot on the ground, every pilot who flew, in case he had to go on the ground, had his own personal survival radio with a little walkie-talkie, but it would broadcast in 3 or 4 frequencies, and it also had a steady tone that just sent out this ear-piercing boom, boom, boom. And if they talked, and we were on that frequency, then we had an instrument in the cockpit that a needle would point and say that's where the signal's coming from, and that's all we could get. So, as we turned up the north and got a steer from rescap flying overhead, and it had to be his wingmen. So at that time, the wingmen usually became rescap, the Rescue Combat Patrol, to give us the vectors and the steers to where their last known sighting was, where they went down. And about that time, we were flying in maybe 100 knots, 110 at the most, probably, because H-2 wouldn't go too much faster. And all of a sudden, I heard this loud whoosh and saw this trail of sparks go by the left-hand side of the aircraft, which was my side. And that was missile number 1 that was shot at us. And it missed, fortunately. And we've continued on up and said, well, they didn't hit us that time. If they hit us, we won't It won't hurt.
Did you have any way of seeing these SAMs?
Oh, no. No. See, in the F-4s and the other aircraft, they had detection equipment that they would know when they were getting locked on. In fact, Zeke Burns, who was the radar intercept officer sitting in the back seat, and Holtzclaw was the pilot in the F-4. When they made a first pass over, they instantly knew that there was somebody down there who was locking on. There was a SAM site that was locking on him. And Zeke, I've seen him and talked with him many times in the years since, and he said, you know, he made the statement to Claw, he said, that guy's pretty hot stuff. And the reason that he said that was not that the system, the SAM site was hot stuff, but the operator was, because he said he's probably a Russian instructor or somebody, because usually you get vip, 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 you know, the sound in your earphones in the headphones that indicate you've been locked on, or that they're searching for you, rather. And then when it goes to lock on, vip, 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 it comes up. He said he took one sweep and he was a lock on. And this guy was good down there. So, but we in the helicopter didn't have anything like that. We had flight instruments. We had airspeed indicator and altimeters and stuff like that. There was no anti-missile defense. We continued to fly up, and we kept trying to get a fix on where they were, where the survivors, where Zeke and Claw were. And by the way, I should say my crewmen were Don West, who was a third-class jet mechanic, and Bruce Dallas, who was a second-class electrician at that time, and sitting in the back. And so we were trying to get a lock on to them, to the survivors. And they were in such a dense jungle. Now, to get into this jungle, they tell us that they had to do a concerted hit the vines like a tackling dummy, like a football tackling dummy, and they could make a few inches. And Zeke, when he ejected out of the seat, broke his ankle and broke his leg. I mean, it's amazing how he was able to do any of this in that. But so they made their way up into the jungle rather than sitting out in the rice paddy where they could be easily found. And so the canopy at that point is about 200 feet, and it's so dense that light's not penetrating, because they had a little bright light strobe. You know, airline passengers flying today get that little briefing on their, if they go down in water and they talk about this little light. Well, that's just a bright strobe light that they had, and couldn't see it. And the other signaling device they had was what we called a pencil flare, and it was just a little cylindrical tube that had a plunger on it, and you would screw in one flare, pull back, and then the spring would go, and it would send up this, you know, like a Roman candle. That wouldn't penetrate the jungle. They couldn't get the flare to go through the canopy, so we had no way of seeing them. Unfortunately, what we also had was 38 caliber survival weapons, and at that time, the Navy was giving out. Instead of it was like a tracer, but it was a magnesium coated, and so it would burn its way out. And they shot that through the jungle canopy, and here was this bright stream of light coming up. It says, okay, now we know about where they are. So we flew up to that point. It's still at 3,000 feet. We get up there, and when we were in the Philippines, we used to practice a quick descent to get from 3,000 to 500 feet as quickly as possible, and it's essentially unload the rotor system, turn it sideways so that there's no lift at all, and just fall out of the sky in a few seconds, and then come and bring it back into control. Now, we're doing this on instruments. About this time, the combat aircraft patrol overhead was dropping parachute flares, and a parachute flare is nothing more than a magnesium light-producing thing that casts the light down, and they have a little flare to make it. It's a metal canister, and the parachute just helps it descend slowly. And so now we have an artificial horizon. We have some moon, you know, a man-made moon, so that we can see the ground, and we can get some shadows and get some relationship with where we are and where we want to be. But as we came up over the 3,000 feet, we got another missile shot at us, and that went by on the starboard side. The Bruce Dallas and Don West both said they saw that one. I didn't see that one because I was on the wrong side of the aircraft. But we came down, got in there, and we found, flew around a couple of turns to see where the most likely landing place was. Now we're on a side slope. It's still rice paddy, but it's all mud. So as we came into approach, Clyde Lassen could not land the helicopter because there was so much mud. It would just sink in. So he was really having to hold a hover with the wheels essentially in the mud. And that was some tricky flying for that time of day and the conditions. And we told Zeke and Claude to come down the hill, and they said, we can't. The jungle is around, you know, we can't get out of here. Come get us, come get us. So we said, okay. Took off, flew back up, found their position where we got right on top of them. We could see the strobe light now, and pulled into a hover. Now, I said this model of H-2 was very underpowered, and it did not want to hover at 200 feet very well, but that was the extent of our cable. We had a 200 foot, maybe it was 150. But anyway, we had to descend below the treetops in a clearing to get the cable close enough to the ground. And Bruce Dallas is the cable operator. He's running it out, and he can see the survivors on the ground. They are probably less than 10 feet away from where the cable was, and they can't get to it because of the density of the jungle and the vines. And we're holding this hover because we have the parachute flares and we can see trees and everything. Then the parachute flares burned out. I had no visual horizon, and we're down among trees, and Clyde starts climbing out, and on the way out we hit a tree. It grabs a hold of the helicopter. We pitch nose down to the left. I can remember this because I can see the branches coming up. Bruce Dallas gets hit in the face by the limb of the tree that we hit, and don't know how, but we flew out of there. But the helicopter's damaged, and we have a vibration now going. The tail rotor's been damaged. There's a little, what would look like a stub wing to a non-aviation person. We call it a horizontal stabilizer. Back on the tail pylon, that has damage. And we get up into the night and fly around for a while. One thing I missed, because this is my claim to fame, I don't believe I overlooked this. Before we went into that hover, we tried to do a hover, didn't have enough power, so Clyde told us, took off and waved off and circled the area and told me to dump fuel. He never told me when to stop dumping fuel, and I decided, well, that's probably enough fuel, and this is going to be one of our saving elements. So after hitting the tree and flying around and having this aircraft get the shutter to it, now it's not flying very well, but it's flying, and we tell them on the ground, we can't do that. I mean, you were 10 feet away and you couldn't get to it. We can't hold that hover. And if you both get on that cable, I don't think we told them this, but I know that we were thinking this. If they both get on the cable, they may just drag us down, and we'd have to cut the cable and leave them there for good. Because that's the only, we had a powder-activated, what we call a guillotine, just a cable cutter, and in case that ever gets snared. So their adrenaline's running high. They can now hear people running along on paths around the jungle around them, looking for them, and calling to them. And these people running in the jungle are, as Zeke and Claude told me, are literally 10, 12 feet away. I mean, the jungle is that dense in that part that they just, were there. So they kept saying, no, you have to come get us. We can't come down. And I remember telling on the radio, I said, we can't come get you, and if you can't come down, then you're staying there tonight. I said, we'll make it. We'll be there. And so that set up the sequence for a couple of approaches into the same rice paddy. Now all of this light and all of the noise and everything, and there's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 villages that I can remember. And village is not a good term, hamlet, just a collection of little hooches and huts around these rice paddies where, I don't know, maybe 30, 40, 50 people would live. I don't know how many would be in there, but we see people stumbling across the dikes of the rice paddy in the parachute flares, and they're shooting at us. And of course, we'd been shot at in the sky when we were flying around, and you see the muzzle flashes coming up, and the little light stuff we just ignored. But then something bigger came along, and that's when we started shooting back. And one of the amusing anecdotes is I had the M16, and Bruce and Don both had M60 mounted guns out either door. And just like split-second timing, Don West on my left side, on my side of the aircraft, and I, with the M16, opened fire at the same time. And this the stillness that we would have. I mean, it was really quiet up there. It was, other than the circumstances, I mean, there was not, much going on in the cockpit as far as noise and that. But all of a sudden, pop, 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 pop. And one of my hot shell casing ricocheted off the windscreen and came back and hit Clyde in the face. And he said, I've been hit. And I thought, oh, hell. Now, I thought something along that line. Now I'm going to have to fly this aircraft. And he reached up, and he wasn't wearing flight gloves, which is against the flight thing. We were flying in marine jungle fatigues with the sleeves rolled up. I mean, you couldn't get away with that in today's safety-conscious Navy in case you go down, you have to have Nomex, and you don't want to burn and all that stuff. So he reaches up, and he feels his hot, wet, sticky stuff coming down. He thinks, oh, I've been hit in the head and I'm bleeding. It was nothing more than his perspiration. So he tasted it and he said, oh, no, I'm okay. So this set up, we made 3 more approaches back into that rice paddy, to shorten the story up. Each time he said, yeah, we can get there. We'd come in, we'd sit, again, holding it in a hover, watching the circle of people in the light come closer and closer to us. Bruce Dallas on the right-hand side is firing back. Don and I are on the left-hand side watching the jungle for any sign of life. And nothing. So we get unnerved, and they say, no, we're not quite there yet. And again, they're hitting the jungle like a tackling dummy. And so that set up the 3 more approaches into this area that we were in. Again, it was on the side slope, and Clyde had to hold it in a modified hover. You could let the weight off just a little bit, but if he let it down, it would sink into the mud. And we saw this circle of people tightening around us, and now you could see, where you could just see figures running before, now you could discern features in the figures. And fortunately, the rice dikes were there, and they were running a crisscross pattern. They couldn't run directly at us. They would run 90 degrees one way. It's like tacking in a sailboat, essentially. And Bruce Dallas was shooting back with the M60 to try and slow him down a little bit. And Don West and I were watching the jungle. And Zeke and Klaus said, nope, can't do it. Came back another time, nope, we're still not there. And so the 3rd time we were back there. Now, I think this is the 5th time we've landed in this same rice paddy, and people know where we're going to be by this time. And Bruce Dallas says we're taking fire from our 6 o'clock. There was somebody coming up the tail back, and he couldn't turn his M60 far enough. Well, the H2 had this little skinny profile, narrow thing. It didn't sit wide, so that was pretty safe there. I mean, they would have to be a good shot to hit us on a run coming from that direction. And about this time, we saw the 2 figures, 2 dark pajama-clad figures, burst out of the jungle and start running towards us. And I told Don, I said, you watch him. If you see a muzzle flash, you start shooting. And unfortunately, it was Claw and Burns in their flight suit. They weren't pajama, but at that distance, you couldn't tell. And they came running across. The last time we came into the approach, we lost our parachute flares again. Everything went black at we were coming through at about 150 feet, descending, slowing back through 60 knots. And on the collective, there are 2 switches that control the lights, and Clyde just flipped them all on. We had spotlight going, the hover spot went straight down. We had nose flaps going out to the right. And there we sat waiting for these people, surrounded by this halo of light, just illuminated us at a target. Prior to this time, the H-2 had a dark gray paint scheme, just like your tape box. And we were on a moonless night. And I'm convinced that's what saved us, because they couldn't see us. They were shooting at a sound, and when they shoot at a sound, it's like trying to shoot a flock of geese where they are. I mean, you have to lead them, and the people on the ground had no idea where we were. I mean, they could hear the noise, but I knew they didn't know where we were, and that saved them. But here we were sitting surrounded in this light, lit up like I told Clyde, like a cruise ship, you know, down in the Caribbean. And that's much of the light that we were watching Zeke and Claude come at us. And they looked at the light and they say, we're not going to run into that light and get shot. I mean, that's we've been in the dark. And even though Zeke Burns had the broken ankle, he beat Claude to the aircraft, to the helicopter. They came around. And why Bruce Dallas did this, I don't know. When we said they're coming out of the jungle, he got out of the aircraft, walked around the front of the aircraft and looked around to see who was coming. And Clyde looked down and says, and he's still connected to his ICS cord, the intercom system, and Clyde looked down to the right and said, Dallas, what the expletive deleted, are you doing out there? Get back in the aircraft. And so about the time Bruce Dallas got back in the aircraft, John Burns rounded the aircraft and started coming in. Now, the deck of the aircraft, the H-2, is probably, I don't know, less than 3 feet above the ground, maybe about that. And so and there was a step on the main landing gear as you went down. And whether Burns missed the step, I don't know, but Bruce Dallas grabbed him by the seat of the pants and with one hand threw him into the back of the aircraft. And about 10 seconds later, John Holtzclaw entered the same way, inverted and up position, just threw him. And the signal was that anytime for the air crewman to tell the pilot that they were ready to leave, that the survivors were on board, was to tap the pilot on the shoulder. Well, Clyde said Bruce almost knocked him out of the seat, even though he was strapped in. So there we go. We took off. And the one comment about it is, as John and Zeke and Claw rounded the nose of the aircraft, we started taking fire from the jungle right where they had come out. The people were that close behind them. And in fact, we learned later that as they were getting to that jungle edge, the guys were, again, 10, 15 feet behind them, shooting at them, and didn't hit them. They could hear the bullets whistling past them and thwacking the ground and the leaves around them. And so they had a lot of incentive to not stay there very much longer. And so as we broke cover and made a very rapid climb out and headed for the beach, and you know, Don West and Bruce Dallas were both using their M60s to shoot back at the people on the ground. John Holtzclaw had his survival radio on, and it was locked on that distress signal going pew, 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 blocking out all transmissions inside the aircraft and outside the aircraft. We could not hear the people on the ship, and now we're getting pretty low on fuel at this time, and couldn't hear anything from the aircraft overhead because it was just so powerful, it just blocked everything else. And Clyde screamed through the cockpit into the cabin. He says, I don't care if you have to strip him naked, get that damn radio and get rid of it. And so when it got that turned off, by this time we had flown up farther north than we wanted to be, and the only way to the ship was a straight line right across some heavy anti-aircraft artillery, shore batteries again. And as we were going through about 1,000 feet and accelerating through about 80, 90 knots, Bruce Dallas slid the cargo door open, or closed on that, and it disappeared. It had been hit, it got damaged by the tree, and it just flew out of his hand and went fluttering down to become a trinket for some North Vietnamese rice paddy farmer. Well, the significance of that is, without the door closed, you have more drag, you use more fuel, you don't go as fast. But we pulled out of there at about 120 knots, which is red line airspeed for the H-2. And we were climbing up, and we went, fortunately, the Jewett, which is the ship we landed on, had broken standing practice and had closed the beach within the 12-mile range. Otherwise, we wouldn't have made it. because as we were climbing out, we got the 20-minute fuel light, and we had about 25 minutes of flight to get to the ship normally. And Clyde had said while we were flying around in the night, he says, we're going to stay here until we have just enough fuel to get feet wet ourselves. And then we'll leave, but not before, you know, unless we could pick them up, of course. And so as we crossed the beach line, I could see down with the lights of Vin to the south of us, I could see a little bit of a horizon in the haze, and it looked like somebody had taken a bunch of flaming arrows and threw it at us. And there was a bit of a horizon, and any pilot who flies knows that if it's on the horizon, it's at your level. And so I scared Clyde for the second time that night, and I screamed at him, get down, and I hit the collective, and we dropped about 500 feet in 5 seconds. And whatever it was that was sent up at us burst probably a mile, a half mile, a quarter mile away. So it didn't, and then we got back up, and as we said, we made an uneventful landing. Clyde did an excellent job. We landed with somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes of fuel in the tank, indicated. Never once were we hit. All that shooting, we were never hit.
The flight lead got a call from the controlling agency and wanted to know if we were configured for escort, and we said yes. And said, well, if you guys can get back to the rendezvous point before this other flight, you can escort a single F-4 that's going to go back in to do an electronic search for a couple of guys that had been shot down the day before. So we dropped off the tanker and headed back in there and beat the other flight out. So we went in with this single F-4. It was searching a particular area, relatively low altitude. And so we were doing a weave up above to make sure we didn't have any MiGs jump the guy. And we'd spent a fair amount of time there, and it was about time, we were about bingo on our fuel, about time for us to leave, and so we were making a big turn to head out of the area, and there was this huge explosion, and aircraft had violent shuddering, vibration. I couldn't read any of the instruments on the instrument panel. It was in a violent roll left and right. There was no response to the throttle or the flight stick control, nothing. It was just like the control stick wasn't even connected to anything anymore. Fire lights were on, and so I knew this wasn't going to go anywhere, and so I yelled over the intercom, "Let's get out!" And and then everything went into slow motion. It was just like time almost stopped. I can remember thinking that you've got to grab the ejection handles now, and it seemed like it took 3 minutes for me to get my hands down to the ejection handles. And when I got a hold of it, I looked down to make sure I had a hold of the right handle, and I pulled on the ejection handle with my head down, which is about as bad a position as you can get in for an ejection. The ejection sequence is going to instantaneously put 15 to 17 Gs on you, and with my head down, rather than being back against a headrest where your spinal column is straight up and down to absorb all that. So that snapped my neck, and I don't remember anything after that. Just before that, I remember I was aware that the canopy came off because there were papers flying around in the cockpit, and then that was all. The next thing, I'm not sure if I'm dreaming or what. It feels like I'm floating in the air, but there's bamboo that's right in front of my face, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I look down, and looks like I'm on the right. Looks like maybe 2 or 3 feet above the ground. On the left side, looks like I'm 15 or 20 feet above the ground. So again, that doesn't make any sense to me. where am I, what's going on, and finally, slowly, things come back to reality of what's going on, and so I'm really exhausted, just too tired to do much of anything. I'm aware that something's wrong with my right arm. Don't know what, just know that's really not usable. Your brain sort of sets its pain threshold that I didn't feel any particular pain, but it turned out that my bone in my right arm was broken, the bone in my right leg was broken, and my left knee was dislocated. And during the ejection sequence, we were probably 450 knots or so going out in the airstream, and that probably most likely snapped my head back, and it ripped my helmet off and then broke my jaw. But again, just hanging in the straps there, other than feeling extremely tired and knowing that something was wrong with my right arm, there wasn't any significant pain. The brain just sets the threshold saying, you idiot, you hurt yourself, and I'm not going to accept all this pain. So also in the back of your parachute harness is 150 feet of nylon rope that's tacked in there, so that if you end up being hung up in a tree, that you can hook it up to your parachute harness, and it's a tree lowering device, sort of like a rappelling system that will let you get down 150 feet anyway. Hopefully you're not in a 200-foot tree. But only having one arm that worked and being tired, I thought, I'm just not going to take all that trouble to do that. Plus there's a vine here right in front of me. I'll just wrap my arm around it, and I'll release my harness, and I'll just sort of slide down the vine to however far I have to go to get to the ground. The F4's harness is difficult to lock into place when you're standing on the floor connecting things, let alone being suspended from it and all your weight on it. So you have to push two little levers to release the harness or your leg strap. And I don't know how long I worked at that, but for a real long time. And then the next thing I remember is that I'm sitting on the ground and leg straps are dangling in front of me. So I was only a couple of feet off the ground. But what turns out the reason was that there's this gigantic tree growing out of the side of this hill, and where the trunk of the tree is growing out of the hill is a little platform, and that's where I happened to be. And the reason it looked like 15 or 20 feet is that off from that platform, the side of the hill sloped very steeply. I could have rolled down the side of the hill. But being on this little platform, and my emergency kit was sitting right beside me, which is normally part of your seat, of the ejection seat. So I had some survival equipment in there, plus you have a survival vest that you wear that has most of your survival equipment on. They had found, again, through trial and error, that a lot of guys that get shot down would lose their survival equipment, and so most of it was put in pockets in the vest. And then again, from experience, they found that lots of times when guys would take the items out of the pocket of the vest and then drop them and then couldn't find them again in the dense jungle and all. So each item was tethered on a string inside of the vest pocket. So I had a significant number of items available to me, and so the first thing I did was pull out my survival radio, and the way you turn it on is essentially you extend the antenna of the radio and it's on. And when I did that, it was in the middle of a transmission. Someone was talking on the emergency frequency. So when they finished the call, then I responded that I'd heard the call. And it turned out it was one of the Sandy aircraft, one of the A-1 aircraft that are part of the search and rescue package with the helicopters. And they were looking for guys that had been shot down. And of course, the North Vietnamese had oftentimes set up traps by getting the radios and making calls and then bringing the search and rescue people in and shooting down the helicopters. And so there was a sequence of codes that had to be passed back and forth to make sure that that this was authentic. And one of the questions that he asked was what my call sign was. And they changed the call signs on every flight. So, and oftentimes they're always different. They're never just the same ones used as a group. So I couldn't remember what my call sign was, and I thought, well, this is going to really be a bad idea. That here I have contact with rescue forces, and they're not going to come in and get me just because I can't remember my call sign. And so he prompted me with a couple of things, and so then I recognized what my call sign was. And so he said, okay, we'll make a search for you here. And said, well, it should be pretty easy. I'm at the base of this really big tree. And, you know, I thought that was going to be a pretty descriptive thing, but then afterwards when I'm thinking when you're in the middle of the forest and you say you're at the base of this really big tree, may not help a lot. So he's flying back and forth, and he says, okay, well, get your flares out and get your signal mirror out, and when I come by, you know, you flash me, and I'll tell you if I want you to ignite one of the flares. Of course, one of the problems with that is other people can see the orange smoke, and not only the search and rescue guys. And so I said, well, the signal mirror is not going to work well because the canopy is so dense I can just see just one little spot at the very top of the canopy, a very small area. Other than that, I can't see anything, so I certainly couldn't get any sunlight in to reflect on the signal mirror. So he says, okay, well, I'll just drive back and forth, and you tell me when you hear me. And so that went on for a while, and finally I heard him, and so I said, okay, I think I'm at your 9 o'clock about now. And so then we start working it in, and so he says, okay, I know where you are. And it turns out that that tree happens to be about 50 feet taller than all the other trees in the area. So it turned out to be fairly descriptive after all. So he says, and I told him that I had quite a few injuries and that I'd need some assistance getting out. So he said, well, that he was pretty low on gas, that he was going to have to go back and refuel, and that'd probably be a couple hours or so before they get back in the area. And so just to get out your medical kit and take some pain medicine, get some extra batteries out for your radio, make sure you've got your flares out, and your compass, and sit back and relax, and we'll be back in a couple hours. And so I thought that sounded like a pretty good idea because I was pretty tired. And so I had my radio out, a spare battery, 2 flares, signal mirror, compass. So I had 6 or 7 things out, and they're all, each one of them was tied on a lanyard to each pocket. And so I looked down in my lap, and it looked like a bowl of spaghetti with all these lanyards on there. So there was no way I could put any of them back in their pockets because they were all twisted up. So I ended up actually cutting several of them off the lanyards. So in my case, since I wasn't able to maneuver around anyway, that didn't help me any by having them on the tied onto the lanyards. So again, with the ejection sequence being unconscious and arms flailing around, it had torn my watch off, so I have no idea what time it was that I was shot down or how long I was on the ground, other than it was the morning go, so time-wise it was probably in the morning. Obviously it was in the morning that I got shot down. And then it was late in the day when they came back again. And I did lay down. Well, I was sitting up occasionally, but it was very tiring just to sit up. So the hill was on a very steep slope, so I could kind of recline laying on the slope, and I was sort of like in a recliner, and I slept for a period of time. And the way I could tell, there was some time had passed, that I could tell where the sun generally was, and I could tell that the sun was lower in the sky than it was earlier in the day. So some significant amount of time had passed. Again, turning the radio on, I think I made one transmission and immediately got a response back. And we set up communications then, and they had several, apparently several missions in to do some suppression there to be able to get the search and rescue forces in. And so at some later time, they said, okay, we're going to bring the helicopters in now, and we'll tell you when to pop your smoke. And so again, it seemed to be a long time, and then finally I did hear helicopters, rotors in the general vicinity. And again, it seemed like a long time before the sound got louder. And finally they said, okay, pop your smoke. And so I ignited the flare. And with the dense foliage around there, the smoke wasn't going anywhere. And I thought, well, I don't know what I can do here to get this smoke out of here. It was just a big orange cloud right around me. And then actually the foliage started to move around some from the downdraft of the rotors of the helicopter. And so then I heard them say that they had my smoke. And then I saw the helicopter, and it looked minuscule. I don't know what altitude he was having to hover at, but it was a long ways away. And so I'm looking almost straight up above me, and it turns out that the tree's about 185 feet tall, so he's got to be slightly above that. So that's quite a distance. And so I'm looking up at the helicopter, and then there's some extra movement of the bamboo, and so I look down, and it takes a second or two to focus, and here's this brown helmet looking at me, and I thought, oh, here's helicopter 185 feet away, and I'm going to be captured. But then as I focused on the face, I could tell that it was American rather than an Asian, and the pararescue guy was there, and that's what had taken so long, is that they had to let the pararescue guy down on the ground to try to find me. And he'd actually gotten hung up in the thick bamboo, and they had to raise him up again and then let him back down and then get off. And then again, it took him a while to find me. And another fortunate thing, I guess, was that my parachute, rather than being blossomed over some of the trees. It was actually wrapped around the lowest limb on this tree, which is maybe 10 or 15 feet off the ground. So it was really not a beacon for anybody to see. And during the time that I was there, I heard people looking for me. They had some kind of a bell that I would hear ringing at different places during the afternoon. And my understanding was that that's how they used to kind of determine where they were in the search pattern, that each group would have a bell and they'd ring it every once in a while to tell each other where they were in the search pattern. So I heard that on a number of occasions, and I really expected to see someone from the sound. What seemed to be close enough, but I never did actually see anyone there. And again, I'm sure if my parachute had been blossomed over one of the trees, that they would have found me long before the search and rescue guys did. But anyway, the pararescue guy did get to me, and so they tried to let a stretcher down to begin with. Well, the canopy was just too dense that they couldn't get the stretcher down through the bamboo. So they put that back up, and they decided that there was a clearing down at the bottom of the hill that we'd have to move down to the bottom of the hill in order to be able to get anything down there to pull us up. And so I told Chuck McGrath was the pararescue guy, and I told him that neither leg was working and my right arm wasn't working, so he was going to have to drag me by my left arm. And so he starts to pull me away, and it turns out again that this side of the hill is very steep, and I don't know if you lay down on your back on a slope, it seems a lot steeper than it really is. And so my impression was that this was like a cliff, and he was just going to pull me off the cliff and then pick me up down at the bottom of the hill. And it was fairly steep, and so as he was pulling me down, as I said, my left knee had been dislocated. Well, it was completely dislocated. It was actually sitting off to the left side of the rest of my leg. And as he was pulling me down the slope, since it was fairly steep, the first time that I really felt pain was that the bottom of my leg fell off to the left side, and I screamed at him to stop, and then I straightened my leg up, and then he pulled me some more, and then it fell off in the other direction. And so I screamed at him again and straightened it up, and fortunately by then we were at the bottom of the hill. And so then we look up, and the helicopter starts to go away, and Chuck says, "It's okay, it's okay." What do you mean it's okay? The helicopter's leaving. And then shortly thereafter, another helicopter. I thought it was the same helicopter, but there were actually two helicopters there. And the reason the first one left was that it had taken so many rounds of small arms fire that it had also shot out the utility hydraulics, so that the winch didn't work anymore. So there was no way for them to pick us up, and they were having to hover at almost 200 feet at one point. And so then it turns out that a second helicopter came in and lowered a tree penetrator. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's kind of the teardrop-shaped thing that has three little paddles on it. That theoretically, you could pull up three people on it, but there's barely enough room for two, let alone, I don't know how you'd ever get three people on it. But anyway, they let that down, and it only has one strap. It has 3 little pedals that you can put down to sit on, and then it has 1 strap. And so Chuck strapped that around me, and I sat on 1 pedal, and he sat on the other one, and we sort of did the bear hug on the way up, and the bad guys apparently had gotten to within about 100 yards of us as we were being pulled up, and there wasn't a lot that they could do. It turned out that it was sort of like a ravine, a very narrow ravine, and they were having to hover at the top of it, and there was a path at the top of the ravine, and there were several of the North Vietnamese up there shooting pretty much horizontally at the helicopter, as well as guys coming up what turned out to be a dry stream bed at the bottom that were shooting at the helicopter and us, and which I wasn't aware of, other than I could hear things. There were a lot of debris and dry leaves and stuff around, and it sounded like somebody was throwing rocks in the dry leaves. And so apparently they were shooting at us from wherever they were. And so as they started pulling us up into the helicopter essentially had to stay in a hover, otherwise they would have been dragging us through the side of the hill on either side. So they kind of had to stay at the hover until they got us up into the helicopter, or at least nearly into the helicopter, before they could move out of the way. And so they continued to take rounds as we were being pulled up. And just as we were right at the door, probably for the 3rd time, I felt some pain, and I didn't know if I had hit something on the helicopter or what, but it turned out that a round had gone through my ankle and shattered my ankle. And the best thing that I could think of to correlate that was if you would take a hammer and just hit yourself just as hard as you could on your ankle. The bullet went right through the middle of the ankle and just split the bone. And so anyway, the guy in the helicopter pulled us in and closed the door. And I remember the crew chief had just had a big smile on his face, and he pointed down at the floor. And I looked down at the floor, and there was a big bullet hole up through the floor. And so we departed the area, and they put a helmet on me so I could talk to the pilot. And I could hear him, but he couldn't hear me. And so there was, again, from the damage that was done from the small arms fire, had shot out part of the intercom system in the helicopter. And so then the pararescue guy wanted to know how I was, and I said, I'm okay, I'm just tired, just want to go to sleep. He said, well, you can't go to sleep. And then he noticed that there's something on my boot, and so again, that was the 4th time that I felt some pain, was when he pulled that boot off my foot to see what had happened there. And then as we were going out, we were in North Vietnam, so, and the operation had taken quite a while, so the helicopter was going to have to air refuel on the way back. And so they had brought C-130 up as far as they could get it to refuel the helicopters on the way out. So they're in the process of refueling on the way out. Obviously the North Vietnamese were monitoring all that was going on, and so they launched a MiG to intercept the helicopters. And it turned out that they were maybe 10 minutes, the MiG was maybe 10 minutes away from the helicopters. The MiG's probably doing 400 knots, and the helicopter's doing 100 knots at the most. So they broke off the air refueling, and the C-130 is trying to accelerate out, and helicopters are going down on the deck, and I thought to myself, oh, no, I don't want to get shot down twice in the same day. And it turned out that Captain Steve Ritchie, the Air Force, I think they're only ace of the Vietnam War, happened to be refueling several miles away and heard what was going on. And so he made a transmission that he was heading back towards to intercept the MiG. Well, he was 40 or 50 miles away, and the MiG was 20 miles away. And so by his conversations saying that he had contact with the MiG and he was locking on and making the intercept and all, that the MiG broke off the intercept, and he was probably maybe a minute away from where the helicopter was, and Steve Ritchie was probably 10 minutes away from the MiG. So that worked, and with the helicopter having taken so much ground fire, they didn't want to stop at the base where the hospital was, so they went back to their home base at Nakhon Phanom, NKP, and then transferred me to another helicopter, and then that helicopter took me up to the hospital. And I remember seeing the clock on the wall. It was about 10 o'clock at night when I was being wheeled in for x-rays and all, and the day had started about 4 o'clock in the morning, so it was a pretty long day. And the timing for the rescue was pretty good too, because it was getting towards the end of the day, and it was sort of the end of the time frame that they would be able to pick me up. Otherwise it would have been the next day before they would have been able to do it.
Prior to going into Cambodia, we were experiencing combat action of some sort in our troop almost every day. Mainly small incidences, but we had one platoon or another, or sometimes a whole troop, in some kind of combat for months, probably 3 or 4 times a week. It kept everybody sharp. Tremendous difference from the war after Cambodia, our war after Cambodia. Prior to going to Cambodia, the enemy had fresh uniforms, they had haircuts, they were clean shaven, they had canned rations, they didn't carry the usual rice sock, as we call it, this cloth, cylinder type or tubular thing stuffed with rice that they would carry. They had rations, they had bandoliers full of ammo. The RPG gunners had at least 3 rounds per RPG. The AKs had probably 8 magazines. They were fresh, sharp, disciplined enemy. Tremendous contrast to afterwards. Our frustration was that we would meet them fresh coming from their base camp, from R&R, or just from coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we couldn't go after them. And we knew there's no way we could win the war unless we could erase that invisible line and go to those base camps, their sanctuaries that they had that prior to that point was only hit when Nixon put his bombing in there. We went over in force at the tip of the fish hook, or real close to it. The fish hook is an area that juts into a border area that juts into South Vietnam, approximately 40 miles. It's like a dagger aiming right towards Saigon, and that because the border area pointed inward like that, it made sense for the enemy to keep their base camps there, because that put them 40 miles closer to the Saigon area and the major population centers. When we crossed over, we went over with the regiment, which was unusual, first regimental maneuver that I had participated in. Actually, I think we had 2 squadrons, if I'm not mistaken, at that first day. Even our regimental commander, Colonel Don Starry, was on the ground instead of the air. And we all thought that was neat and had held a tremendous amount of respect for him for doing that. He was wounded 3 days later and brought into the same hospital where I was, actually. That was upsetting to see him being brought in. My platoon was the scout platoon when we went in. They had a tank company in front and the troops following, and the column went in, as I recall, it was a double column, which is 2 files side by side. There were areas where we had a different maneuver formation as we first crossed over the border in some marshy areas, but we could move faster when it was on a column formation. The scout platoon, I'm sorry, let me back up. If you can imagine over 100 armored vehicles in 2 columns maneuvering, it's a lot of firepower, a lot of people, a lot of vehicles. Up ahead we had the air cav troop flying back and forth, and they're scouting the flanks, they're scouting ahead. And when they saw something, they had to have an element on the ground that was delegated to go out and check it out. And that was my platoon. And so my platoon was sent to go here, to go there, anywhere that the aircraft troops saw something in our line of march. And one particular point, after a series of very small firefights, I remember hearing the Loach overhead. I don't know if it was the S3 or someone else, but saying you have, they said, enemy on the left flank. No, on the right flank. No, they're everywhere. And I was told first to go to the left, so I took my men off with 9 tracks off to the left. We went in a wedge formation. Didn't go but a couple hundred meters, then when we were told to turn back, go to the right side. So our column was still moving, and I had to traverse, go through the moving column. As they were going one way, I had to cross through them to go to the other flank. And during that process, I lost a Sheridan. It threw a track right there on the edge of the road. So I put the rest of the troop of my platoon on a line formation with an echelon to the right. That was to protect the right flank. 3 vehicles off, the rest on the line. And I could see the enemy. The enemy was running in front of us. Now the foliage was light. The trees were 2 to 4 inches thick. We were able to go a little bit faster than a man running, pushing them down as we moved forward. And I was asking for permission to fire. This is my main thing. I was calling up. I said, I see them. I'm going to fire. And I was told, negative, don't fire. And the reason they were telling us not to fire was they were maneuvering some of the troops up ahead, I think it was a tank company, around, and they didn't want us to have a friendly fire engagement. And my men were yelling, I see them. I want to fire them, and I'm telling them we can't. And the same token, we had this sense that they're leading us, baiting us, and they were. And after about 200 meters or so, the light foliage became just a solid green wall of thick jungle vegetation. And as we approached that, that's when I knew we had to fire. And as I was just at that point saying, fire, boom, all hell broke loose. And they fired within a split second before we started pulling our trigger. And they began by focusing RPGs on my Sheridans, and they took those out instantly. I was wounded, even though I wasn't on the Sheridan. I was wounded from that blast. A piece of torso. I flew across this area of about 30 feet, and it hit me in the side of the head. And it took a while before I could just shake the stars out of my eyes. And pulled this thing off, and I couldn't believe what it was. And it was a piece of torso of the commander of Sheridan. He took the RPG hit. It just hit him right in his chest area. And it was like getting hit in the head with a baseball. I mean, it hit me that hard. Boom. And it took maybe, I don't know, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, I'm not sure, to recover from that. But by then, all hell broke loose. And that track was down. The Sheridan looked like a wounded elephant. I'm sorry. It looked like a wounded elephant because when the track commander was hit, either here, the gunner was also wounded, hit the turret control, and the gun just sort of went down toward the ground, and it just looked like a dying dinosaur. And the enemy was in a zigzag trench that they just built. Fresh, you could see it. The logs were just laid within days. And the enemy knew where we were going before we did, which was amazing. They set up this ambush. And some enemy from the trench was starting to get out of the trench to get on top of that Sheridan. And they were only like 40 feet away. Probably to take over the 50 caliber or the M60. I don't think they could have done anything with that Sheridan main gun. And I had 5 days before that suffered a lot of casualties in my platoon. I had 7 people. We had several killed and wounded, and 7 were gone from my platoon. So I was light. Each track was minus a person. My own track when we went into Vietnam was short a gunner. I had 3 machine guns and I only had 2 gunners. So my machine gun on my right flank was unmanned. I had myself, my driver, a left gunner. He could go back and forth, right or left gun, and a medic who's a conscientious objector who couldn't pick up a weapon. And I saw the people come up out of the trench, and I was maneuvering my 50 over, and I was firing my 50 caliber and talking on the radio at the same time. And I was yelling for the CO, you know, and trying to get either artillery or get the gunships overhead. And I remember telling the CO that the Sheridan was hit. And I was putting some fire down at the machine gun was firing at us. And I couldn't disengage to get the guys who were ready to leave the trench. It was either leave the gun alone, it was aimed at me and the track next to me, or get the ones who were going to come out of the trench. And they weren't firing, I was getting the one that was firing. But then my medic, PFC Doc Daly, who joined me just 5 days earlier when I lost another medic, was a conscientious objector. I don't think he ever fired a weapon. But he jumped up and he grabbed that M60, that side gun, and had seen enough of the other troopers firing it, and he got a hold of that weapon and he laid down a solid base of fire and stopped that assault. We were going to come out of that trench line. He even knew how to reload, which I didn't think he did. For us, that was not an easy chore. We kept a 200-round link in the M60s, and then inside we had these heavy cans we called mini cans that did 1,200 rounds, and he threw that up on top by himself and was loading that when enemy RPG gunner took him out our track next, and it hit him right here. And killed him instantly. It was his position was like 3.5 feet from me to this direction, inside my track, and he didn't fall right away. He stood, which was amazing that he stood there like that. And I was in the blast area of the RPG. The white hot flame, it burned off all my exposed hair, my arms, my eyebrows, back of my neck. Hit me back with shrapnel, about 40 holes, mostly small, a couple big ones. Piece of his skull went inside my neck, about this big. And that took off a lot of the arm muscle, forearm muscle from my left gunner, who is Dylan, a southern boy who I haven't seen since that day. I hope to someday. I just remember him. He didn't slow down. You know, he was cursing and cussing, and he kept firing. Then my track was pretty silent for a little while. He was able to fire, Dylan, and my radios were out. Actually, didn't matter because I couldn't hear anyway. That explosion took out my ears, and I got my 50 up and going again. It took, I don't know how long, 20 seconds to recover from that. And an NVA soldier, again, out of the trench line, stood up, and first thing he did was he fired a burst with the AK and just sort of sprayed the side of my vehicle, and I felt several rounds impact on my Prick 25 radio, which is my emergency radio, and it took that radio out too. So I had no radio communications, even if I could hear. And I got a ricochet from that hit my right tricep, and it severed my tricep. The tricep fell down to my elbow, basically, and my arm went into a spasm, and I couldn't control it, and I couldn't fire my 50, because you need two hands on that 50, and the operating handle's on the right side, and I couldn't do it left-handed. And I tried, and I couldn't do it. So I took my right hand, and I just shoved it in my belt to keep my arm from being spastic like that. And the enemy were still in the trenches. You could see them coming into the woods, or actually I think it was from other trenches, adjoining trenches coming up to our area, because our area now was almost silent. The Sheridan was down. My track, in effect, was down. And first thing I grabbed for was the M16, because we kept the M16 back here, and I swung the M16 around, and I just made a mistake. I put on full auto, and if you've ever fired an M16 on full rock and roll, it's useless. You know, it just goes everywhere. And when trying to do it one-handed, unbraced, I just shot a bunch of trees. And I dropped it, and I reached behind me, grabbed our M79, which we always kept there, and I pulled the M79 around. But as I pulled it around, the stock fell off. So during that explosion, it destroyed that too. And the explosion also knocked off all but one can of 50 caliber ammo. So and I couldn't jack that back anyway. So what I had left was frags, and I had my pistol. And so I had my 45, but I'm right-handed and not left. And I was able to lay my pistol across the gun shield. And it's hard to see because I had dust and blood in my glasses. So my world was a surrealistic view. It was painted blood red. You can just imagine that. That's the only thing I saw. And it was slow motion. It's like you read in a book, or maybe see depicted in a movie, where it takes 2-3 seconds for a professional soldier to change a magazine. You know, I mean, it's fast. Off it goes, you slam in a new one, and you're ready to go. But this guy took forever. Everything was slow motion as he took out the magazine and dropped it down and grabbed another one. And while he was doing that, I was able to squeeze off 7 rounds with my 45. And slowly at first, because I really couldn't see where I was going. And the last round hit him in the chest, and that's when I fell in love with the 45, because it picked him up out of that trench and just set him back about 2 feet, and his legs laying down inside. By that point, we had no more firepower we could use in my track, and I started throwing hand grenades. I grabbed the first grenade and I threw it, and nothing happened. I realized I forgot to pull the pin, and I got another one. I had all kinds of grenades around me. So I had a can of them, and I had them strung along the inside of my cupola. I had smoke grenades, I had flares, thermites, frags. And the second grenade, I got it because I remembered I got to pull the pin. And I couldn't pull the pin. I mean, all my training, 3 years of good infantry training at Fort Benning, Fort Lewis, Fort Ord, and Panama, nobody taught me how a one-armed man's going to throw an arm and hand grenade. And I tried with my teeth like John Wayne did. And I still have a chip in that tooth. I couldn't do it. I just chipped my damn tooth. And so I'm crouched down, and I could hear the rounds ricocheting off of my gun shield. My driver was he's a young fellow. He had his M16, and he's popping in and out, firing everything he could have just over his head out of the driver's compartment. But I finally realized that if I hooked the pin of my hand grenade across the sight of my .50 caliber, I can pull it out. And so I did that, and I threw maybe the equivalent of half a case of hand grenades. I threw smoke grenades, flares. When those were gone, I stood up in the cupola, and I was throwing the ammo cans with my left hand. I threw everything, and in front of me was every color. And I don't know if I hit anybody or killed anybody or not, but it was smoky as hell, and quiet at that there. And then I started to get my hearing back just a little bit, and I got off my track, and I could see another track about 50 feet over, and real slow. I had my .45, and I was able to put in an extra magazine, and I was trying to traverse that area. As I'm going over to that track, I'm seeing dust being kicked up around me, and I'm trying to go fast, but it's just real slow. And then I see the guys in the track yelling for me to come on. And when I got there, I put my hand up, and they pulled me up. And best I could, I got the radio, and I tried to get a casualty count, but I just couldn't hear very well. And but I went to each track, and I think the track commander got the casualty count, and we got the troop CO, Captain Menzel, on the radio, and he said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming up." So we held the line, and I was able to maintain consciousness until I saw the tracks coming in behind us, and then he brought his reserve platoon in between our tracks, and then they continued the battle, and which was over within a few more minutes. I woke up on the ground on a stretcher, and I was on my back. First thing I wondered was, why am I on my back? It hurt so much because I was wounded in my back. I couldn't understand why they put me on my back. It hurt like hell. And I was, one of my soldiers, and I don't remember who it was standing over me, and he had a warm Budweiser in one hand and a cigarette. And he just stood over me, and he said, I asked him, "How'd we do?" He said there was like 50 bodies out there. And I said, "No, how many did we lose?" And he told me the names. And the first 2 fatalities during the official invasion, May 1st, 1970, were from my platoon. I was the first 2 men killed were my men in that invasion. I was first platoon leader, dusted off in that invasion. So they did real dubious honor. The shocking thing was my platoon of 44 men, that had 44 men just 3 weeks prior to that, was down to 23 or 24, from the casualties of the previous 2 weeks and that day.